Everybody, we're back. This is the Pikkal podcast report. I'm going to be sharing with you in the next 10, 12 minutes some insights into the world of podcasting from our research team, sharing with you live here on LinkedIn and on YouTube. If you have any questions about this research, if you're interested in corporate or B2B podcasts, then you can ping me, send me a DM on LinkedIn, and happy to chat with you. Answer any kind of questions that you have about podcasts, corporate podcasts. There's no such thing as a newbie question or a stupid question. So feel free to ask away. And if you're watching on the live stream as well, feel free to drop a comment in the comment box. You know what to do. You know the drill. Hey, you know what? We've been talking about corporate podcasts and the podcast market the last couple of weeks. Some of the key data points coming out of the research are that we have 5 million podcasts in the world today. Just quick preview of the report. I'll be covering slides. If we can zoom in on this, I'll be covering some of the slides in coming weeks, some of the key data points about this report. There are a lot of data points about podcasts. So if you need data points, just talk to me. You know, we've got data coming out of our ears at Pikkal. So this is the corporate podcast report by Pikkal. Today, I want to talk about a really important fact, which is shelf space in podcasts. Now, let me explain. There are 5 million podcasts in the world today. And as it says here with the data, the average podcast listener has only 7 in this thing, in their phone, in their feed. Now, that's really important. If you look at the data, that's about 1 in a million. So if somebody subscribes to your podcast, that's a 1 in a million podcast, right? So think about that data, because what it means is that if somebody is going to listen to your podcast, there must be a really good reason why they listen to your podcast. And this is what I want to talk about today. And it actually is probably the biggest mistake that people make when they start a podcast. So if you haven't met me already, my name's Graham Brown. I run a corporate podcast agency with my team here in different markets. We're based in Singapore, in London. We are also based in the US and parts of Europe with our recording team. What I found in recording 3,000 plus episodes, and you know, I've been doing this for a number of years, is that often when people get into podcasts, they make this mistake, and that is they don't start with the audience in mind. This is probably why, if you have a business podcast, if you have a corporate podcast, and you are struggling to get audience or build your audience, I would say, from my experience, if I was to look at your podcast, the number one problem there isn't your content, it's your connection. So let me explain that. It doesn't lie in the content you're covering inside the podcast. It lies in how you connect with your audience. And probably the part that many people skip when they start a podcast is they say, this is what I want to talk about. They don't say or think, what does my audience want me to solve for them? And when I start a podcast project with corporate and B2B clients, the number one starting point is addressing this shelf space issue, which is essentially that what is the pain point of your listeners? What is keeping them up at night? What is bothering them? What are the big macro changes in the last couple of years that are disturbing your audience? Because when you address those issues, then you have their attention. When you have their attention, you have the ability to influence them and create change. Only at that point, only when they know that you care, do they care what you know. So many people go out there and start a podcast and say, this is what I know. Nobody cares. Nobody cares because you don't care. You don't care about what their pain points are. And you don't go to that pain point, which is say, look, I understand I have 15, 20 years experience in this industry as a, for example, data analyst or whatever you want to call yourself, whatever your shtick is, whatever that is your authority to solve that problem. If you can lean into the problem of the audience and say, look, this is what I want to solve for you because I understand your pain. I'm leaning into this problem, then you have their attention, because attention is no longer about job title or your expertise. Attention is about your ability to solve somebody's problem better than the next guy. And so for the next few minutes, I want to show you a few tips and tricks that I use to help people understand and get to the point of really understanding who your market is. Who are you talking to? And how can you solve their pain? When it comes to a podcast, you've got to get into that shelf space. So what I want to do is I want to show you, for example, one of the most popular podcast categories in business. I'm just going to share my screen here. So let's zoom in on this. What I want to show you now is I'm showing you leadership podcasts. So these are the most popular leadership podcasts based on title alone. So if they have the word leadership in them, and these are ranked by listeners. So what you see at the top of the list here is the Craig Groeschel Leadership Podcast with 288,000 listeners. And that's a very large podcast, followed by a number of other leadership podcasts, including John Maxwell's Maxwell Leadership Podcast, Andy Stanley. You've got Enterprise Sales and Marketing Leadership, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have sort of more niche ones like women's leadership, et cetera. So what am I getting to here? It's the same. If I was to take you to Amazon and I would show you, for example, the most popular leadership books. Now, if you were to scroll through these books, you'll start to see a pattern. And this is the pattern that I want you today to take away and think about. Because what I am showing you here in both podcasts, on popular platforms, and books is that the most popular ones, ranked by listeners, and in this case in Amazon, bestsellers, all follow a similar pattern. And this is what I call the 3 M's. And I'll tell you about the 3 M's in a minute. So here we have the most popular books. We have Leadership and Self-Deception. Now note that, self-deception. Leadership Theory and Practice by Peter Northaus, who's quite a famous leadership professor. Then you have the celebrity names like John Maxwell's Leadership. Then you have Conscious Leadership, obviously John Maxwell again, et cetera, et cetera. You know, Managing Narcissists, Humble Leadership, Servant Leadership, Student Leadership, John Maxwell again, H3 Leadership, Be Humble, Stay Hungry, Always Hustle, Peter Northaus again, Toy Box Leadership. All right, there is a pattern here. And this is what I want to impress upon you today. Let's go back to the podcast data. Now, the 3 M's of choosing your category, your talking points, your focus. This is one, the Craig Groeschel Leadership Podcast, Life Church. Now, Craig's podcast is the most popular leadership podcast in the world, with 288,000 listeners, which is in like the top, it's not even in the top 1%, it's like the top 0.2% of all podcasts globally. And what's interesting about this is its focus. So this is the first M, market. So Craig's podcast knows exactly who his market is. This is focusing on church. It's a Christian podcast. It's focusing on pastors. So, you know, Craig is a pastor. Therefore, he knows his audience really well, and he's talking to that market. It's not editing or changing his message to meet other audience expectations. It's unedited, unapologetic. That's the first M, market. The second M, if we look at John Maxwell, for example, in podcast success, this is media. So media attention. John Maxwell has media attention. He is a name. He is a thought leader in this space and has been doing this for years and years. John Maxwell's books have been selling for decades. So he has attention, media. That's the second M. Now, the third M is model. And this basically means you are applying a different approach to the problem. In this case, if we were to go back to the best-selling books, if I scroll down here, for example, the first one that comes up as model, H3 Leadership, Humble, Hungry, hustle. So that is their model. And if you have a look at some of the other the other books here, we have, for example, Peter Northouse, Media Attention, John Maxwell, Media, 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. Now, conscious leadership could be a model and it could be a market. It could be aimed, for example, at people who are more spiritual. It could be a model for leadership. Second one here down, John Maxwell, again, Media, and Peter Northouse, Media, Leadership and Culture, Why Managers Fail. This may be a model. They are taking a different approach to the problem, which is we are looking at it through a different paradigm, a different angle. Let's go down here. Managing Narcissists, Blamers, Dramatics, and more. Again, this is a model. They are taking a different approach to the problem of leadership. So they know who is interested in this potential understanding, this framing of the solution of the problem. And therefore, they speak to it and they don't edit their message. Humble leadership, again, model. Servant leadership, again, model. Student leadership, this is probably market. They know that they are talking to maybe educators or even students, for example, or people in higher education, whatever that market is. They know exactly who they are talking to. So what does this mean to you? Let's bring this back. So what this means is that when you create a corporate or business podcast, you need to think about one of the 3 M's to define your podcast, to stand out. Again, it goes back to where we started this conversation today. It goes back to shelf space, because there are only 7 potential slots in the shelf that your podcast can fit in. And if you don't want to constantly be hustling and getting new listeners all the time, you have to focus on subscribers. And to get subscribers, you have to be something to somebody, not everything to everybody. So if you have a leadership podcast, it's no longer enough. The only way you can make a leadership podcast work is either you have media attention, i.e. you're John Maxwell or you're Barack Obama. Secondly, you have a market defined specifically. For example, you're focused on women in leadership, or you're focused on student leadership, or you're focusing maybe on mindful leadership. And thirdly, the other way to make a leadership podcast work is you know exactly what you're focusing on when it comes to the model. Maybe you have the 3 H's. We've seen that, for example, or you have the humble leadership model or the servant leadership model. That will get people's attention and create a tribe around what you do. So let's put this into practice. For example, let's go now to some more searches. I'm going to have a look at a very popular topic, digital transformation. Very popular B2B topic. We are looking at digital transformation podcasts. Now, again, it's a very much like leadership. It's a very generic business term. It can mean a lot of different things. So if you were creating a digital transformation podcast, it's important that you have one of the 3 M's to stand out. First one being, for example, you may be a senior executive in a very well-known tech company. That would make sense. You would have media attention. The second model being that you have a different way to approach digital transformation than everybody else, the humble digital transformation, the 3 H's of digital transformation. And the third one being is you know exactly your market. And this is interesting because the first and most popular digital transformation podcast in the world isn't the digital transformation podcast. It is the private equity digital transformation show. Now, that's really important because you would probably think that the people in private equity interested in digital transformation is probably a small market, but actually it's big enough to create the biggest digital transformation podcast in the world. And this is what I would advise all my clients. And if I was to work with you, the same thing is that, don't worry about focusing on a niche, because those niches are big enough globally. The private equity digital transformation podcast, it gets 5,000 listeners per episode. It's not Craig's leadership podcast by any means. But firstly, these are people in digital transformation space. And secondly, they're involved in private equity. That's a subset of a subset. And that means that this podcast, by defining their market and keeping it very focused on that market rather than going broad and trying to get 10x their audience, is building a tribe around what they do. And 5,000 people in private equity listening to your podcast on a regular basis, that's a big deal. That's a very valuable audience. And the way you get to that, let's bring it all the way back to the beginning, is you focus on the connection, not the content. What's obviously, you've got to have content, you've got to have quality content that gets you in the game. But if you want to be the best digital transformation podcast in the world, it's not about having the best content in the world. It's about having the best connection in the world. You need to focus on that 5% of the market who don't like what you do. They love what you do, because this podcast, what it will speak to is the pain, not of your average executive, not of your average bank manager, but of a fund manager or a private equity principal, for example. They know exactly what their pain points are, the language that they speak, and they don't edit it. They don't feel when they talk about PE on the show that they need to edit their message for people who don't quite get it. It's not for them. And that's the point. They focus on their fans. The rest is mere detail. So today we had a look at the importance of shelf space in podcasting. And we looked at why, in this world of sort of unlimited supply of podcast, where it's getting so much easier to produce a podcast and therefore harder to promote, the onus is on us as podcast managers or corporate brands wanting to communicate with our markets to focus on that tribe of people who really care about what you do. You know, create conversations that matter with people who care, not content. That's different entirely. So today we've had a look at shelf space. We've looked at some of the insights from the corporate podcast report. If you're interested in these insights, you know where to get me. There are a lot of more insights coming in this report that I'm looking forward to sharing with you. My name's Graham Brown. You know where to find me on Pikkal and on LinkedIn. I'll see you here if you're joining me live on LinkedIn or on YouTube, or if you're listening on the archives next time. Feel free to reach out.